Okay, hi students. Very good morning. Hope you're fine. Welcome to Quantifiers and welcome to the quiz session on a verbal section. Okay. Now this again is a kind of a CAT replica. Okay, where it comprises of one RC passage and three non-RC based questions. The passage this time was slightly tricky, something from a biology field. Okay, related to the theory of evolution. Okay, the sentence rearrangement was also tricky. The odd one out, I could say it was of a moderate level, and the para summary also, I could say it was of a moderate level. But overall, this paper, I would rate it as a moderate to a difficult paper. Okay, so let's get into the mode of solving the passage. I hope you got most of your answers correct. So, and you have solved this particular passage before we actually move on to understanding it. Okay, so yeah, evolution is a fascinating field, but can be rife with misunderstanding. Okay, so the very first line only we can see that the author's opinion is present. So it's the author's opinion, okay, that evolution, it seems to be a quite fascinating field, but it is actually rife with misunderstanding. But I mean, like, there's many amount of the misunderstandings that are being present. Okay, one misconception is that the evolution has some innate sense of direction or purpose. Okay, so one misconception that the author feels is that the evolution has some innate, okay, sense of direction or purpose. In reality, evolution is a mindless, plan free phenomenon driven into endless possibilities by random mutation. Okay, so the author is saying initially that the evolution is actually is ruffled with a lot of misunderstanding. Okay, and one such misunderstanding is that they believe that the evolution has some natural sense of direction or purpose. Okay, like there is a purpose behind the evolution, but he's saying that the evolution is actually a mindless, plan free phenomenon. I mean, like, there is no particular purpose for it. Okay, there are some areas of evolutionary biology where benefits are murkier. Okay, murkier actually stands for something which is questionable, and in some instances where trade seems to make no sense at all. Okay, as important as the concept of survival of the fittest is to evolution, there are many examples that seem to undermine this idea. Okay, so what the author says that there are many examples which actually undermine the theory of the survival of the fittest. Okay, in fact, various aspects of evolutionary biology may seem counterintuitive, okay, and could even be seen as a reason to reject evolution as a whole. Okay, so very very important paragraph from the point of view of your understanding of the passage. So let's just make a note of it. Okay, so what is saying that the author is saying that evolution is something which is a fascinating field, but there are a lot of misunderstandings to it. Okay, so the basic misunderstanding is that the evolution is actually a mindless. Okay, so we believe that there has been a lot of research which is being done, okay, at the end of the what's it the nature, okay, when it comes to the evolution, but evolution is actually something which is a mindless. Okay, then there are some areas of evolutionary biology where benefits are murkier, and in some instances where trade seems to make no sense at all. Okay, so he's saying that there are some traits which makes no sense at all. So as important as the concept of the survival of the fittest, there are many examples that seem to undermine this idea. So the author here is saying, let's say, the idea of the survival of fittest, okay, it is actually undermined. Now what does the survival of the fittest say is that who is the fit person that will gonna stay and the unfit person will going to be eliminated. Okay, so they are saying that there are many examples which actually undermine this area. In fact, the various aspects of evolutionary biology may seem counterintuitive. Okay, now counterintuitive is like, it does not happen in the way you would expect it to be. Okay, and could ever be seen as a reason to reject evolution as a whole. Okay, So evolution can be rejected as a whole. And then in case, again, if I want to summarize this particular passage, then I would say that the evolution is actually riddled with a lot of misunderstanding, okay? And then the concept of the survival of the fittest, it seems to be logic, but then there are many examples which actually undermine this concept of the survival of fittest, okay? So let's get into the second paragraph of the passage. So many species invest heavily in camouflage and other means of blending into the surroundings to avoid predators. So okay, so I'll just give you one common example. So sparrow, in case if you know, okay, so sparrow, I mean, that is a kind of an extinct, but in case if you notice it, okay, so it has body, it's a brown color and all that. So it's, if in case it is sitting with on a tree branch and all that, okay, so you'll not be able to identify as if the sparrow is sitting actually in that particular tree branch, okay? So it actually camouflage. The one example of the camouflage, we call it as an army dress, okay? So the reason that the army dress has those kinds of a patches, the reason is that in case if they're going in a field and all that, so in case if they lie down, they're going to actually camouflage, they're going to actually mix with the surroundings, okay? So he's saying that the many species invest heavily in camouflage and other kinds of blendings into the surroundings to avoid predators, okay? So the physically heavy and downright ostentatious plumage of birds of paradise, peacocks, and many other birds seems like a clear invitation to be eaten, okay? So like a sparrow which can camouflage, the peacock is quite ostensible. I mean, like that is kind of a showing off. We can immediately find out from, let's say, the feathers of the peacock that the peacock is sitting, and it's kind of a show of the ostentatious plumage, okay? So that means that it is an invitation for the bird to be eaten. But crucially, they help these birds to pass on their genes because they increase their chances of attracting a mate, okay? But the reason why this, okay, so the feathers of the peacock seems useless, that there's no purpose that the feather of the peacock actually serves, okay? Because the other birds have the camouflage kind of a thing, but then there is a reason behind it, okay? So the trait which actually seems to be useless, okay, there is a reason behind it. So that is actually to give you an identity so that you can actually pass on the genes to the another generations, okay? So it strengthens this theory of evolution in that these seemingly weaker individuals are actually showing you how well they can do in the face of adversity, okay? So it strengthens the theory of evolution in that these seemingly weaker individuals are actually showing how well they can do it in the face of adversity. It is the evolutionary equivalent of using a pretty overconfident dating profiles to impress potential partners. Okay, just he's giving you an example. Okay, so he's saying, okay, that I would say that the attention-seeking feather of birds that attract mates. Okay, so they actually is a kind of a thing. They seems to be useless at one go. Okay, but then there is a purpose behind it. Okay, so that is the case. Now, when an anatomical structure appears frankly inept, okay, now inept is something which is not skilled, okay, or not effective, I would say, okay, it is probably a vestigial trait, okay. So when an anatomical structure appears frankly inept, it is probably a vestigial trait. This is a feature that no longer does whatever make it advantageous enough to evolve in the first place, okay. So here the author has actually given us the definition of an vestigial organ, okay. If we could embody evolution as a person, then he or she would be creative but inherent lazy. If something is not being used, then why bother maintaining it? It's hard to say why they haven't disappeared altogether, but give it other million years and perhaps they will. Some snakes, for example, still show vestigial traits harking back to their four-legged ancestry. Male pythons have little claw-like structures towards the tail, which although they aid courtship are all the remain of their hind limbs, okay. So the author here is doing nothing, but he's actually explaining us the vestigial organs, okay. So again, to explain you the vestigial organs, I'll give you an easy example, that is of an appendix in the human body, okay. So now you got an appendicitis, which is an operation which removes the appendix. So appendix initially used to serve the purpose in the human digestion, okay, because when our ancestors used to eat the raw food and all that, okay, so at that time the appendix used to play a role and a part, okay, but now since our food is refined, okay, it is no more needed, okay, so that is the reason that the appendix is treated as a vestigial organ, and that is what the author is explaining in this paragraph, okay. So when an anatomical structure appears frankly inept, it is probably this is a feature that no longer does whatever make it advantageous enough to evolve in the first place, okay. But then he's saying that this particular organ will going to be extinct, it will going to be disappear, okay, but it will gonna take another million years, and then he's giving some examples of the appendix organs. Next he's mentioned are the spandrels, okay. Now the spandrels are in many ways the rarest and hardest to see weird evolutionary quirks, okay. The word comes from an architectural term for triangular section between arcs in the older, usually fancy buildings. These zones were often ornately decorated but incidental to the real function of the structure of the building. Okay, so now he's explaining. Now, the spandrel I'll give you, in case if you have seen any historical temple or a monument, then it has this kind of a triangular. Okay, so there may be one particular image here, and then there is one particular image here. Okay, so it is the main purpose is it has no purpose, okay, but it is just to increase the beauty of that particular thing. But other than that, okay, it is ornately decorated but incidental, okay. Incidental, that means it's less important to the real function of the structure of the building, okay. An evolutionary spandrel, now this again explains you what an evolutionary spandrel is. An evolutionary spandrel is a physical structure or behavioral characteristic that is a byproduct from some other functional adaptation, okay. So it is actually a byproduct of some other functional adaptation. One well-studied example is seen as an island-dwelling population of Italian wall lizards, which spend less time basking in the sun than their mainland cousins. This behavior can be seen as a spandrel because there's no obvious advantage to it, okay. So the spandrel is basically, now see, there is a difference between an appendix and the spandrel, okay. So appendix is something which we used to use earlier, but no more in use right now, okay. Whereas the spandrel is that which do not serve any purpose, okay, but it is there because of, let's say, where is the cursor, okay, but because of where it is, but because of a byproduct from of it, okay. So there is a Italian lizards, okay, so they spend very less time, okay, basking in the sun, okay, but then soaking in the sun for that matter, than the rest of their cousins, but this particular trait of them have no particular advantage, okay. And one examples I'll give you for the spandrel, which will gonna make spandrel much more clear, is, let's say, the webbing between the human fingers. So you know what is a webbing between? So the webbing actually helps us to separate the 5 fingers, including one thumb, from each other. Okay, so webbing, let me just draw it here. So this is your hand. Sorry, I'm very bad. Okay, so now this part is actually a webbing. Okay, now this webbing is a spandrel. Okay, which does not have any particular purpose. Okay, but this is a byproduct. Okay, the byproduct to make something more useful, that is to actually separate each finger units from each other. Okay, so that is the webbing. So webbing could be an example of a spandrel, in case if you understand what I'm doing and what I'm saying. One genuine exception is something that defines our species as modern human beings, the chin. No other animals or even extinct human relatives such as the Neanderthals have one. As human diets changed, the bones and the muscles in our jaws became smaller, so we don't waste energy on them, but we were left with a protruding bone at the bottom of the face, and no one has come up with a whole convincing reason why. Although the chin throws a spandrel in the work, there is nearly always a reason or at least an explanation for the myriad traits we see across biology. And this is actually the key and the main idea of the author, okay. So the author is saying that the spandrels are there, okay. So the chin is a spandrel, okay, because it at one go, in case if we look at the chin, it has no purpose, okay, because nobody other has it, okay. But then he's telling that in case if we go deeper, it actually helps, okay. It helps us in bones and become smaller. We didn't waste energy on them, but we are left with portraying, and no one has come up with a wholly convincing reason why. So although the chin throws a spindle in the work, there is nearly always a reason or at least an explanation for the myriad traits we see across biology. Okay, so he says that anything that appears to be vestigial or the spindle, okay, at one go they seem to be useless, but they're not actually useless. There is some kind of an explanation behind that particular trait in biology. Okay, so in case if I have to just summarize this particular passage, okay, so I would say that the argument that the author presents in the passage is that traits which seems counterintuitive, okay, and which seems counterintuitive or let's say redundant in living creatures actually have some kind of a basis in evolution. Okay, so that traits that seem to be counterintuitive or they seem to be useless or they seem to be actually redundant, there is some kind of basis for it in evolution. Okay, like there has to be some kind of a reason in the evolutionary that why this particular trait is being present. Okay, so then the author goes on and gives us the example. Okay, for example, the attention seeking this feathers, okay, of birds, okay, that attract mates. Okay, so there is a reason, okay, that this is, there's a purpose that why these birds have a kind of an attention seeking feathers, because they actually attract a mate. Okay, attract a mate. Okay, and then he goes on to give us an example of a human chin. Okay, that human chin, okay, that has, like I would say, carried for a larger muscles. Okay, has carried over for a larger muscles and jaws for intensive chewing. There is a purpose. Okay, these example further these example I would say help the author makes argument that strengthen the theory of evolution. Okay, that seemingly weakened individuals can show how well they can do it in the form of adversity. He mentioned about this, no, adversity part. Okay, so I would say, okay, so the same argument the author also makes about the vestigial, proving that evolution has a role to play in a trait that appears quirky or useless if one studies them closely. But there's always a purpose. Okay, there is always a purpose. Okay, so they seems like vestigial or let's say the spindle. They seem apparently useless, but they have a evolutionary function. There is an evolutionary function. Okay, behind them. Okay, so I hope that this particular passage is clear. So author initially again, like this was somewhat I would say a kind of a difficult read. Okay, but you need to understand it. Okay, so in case just a summary, basically that the traits which actually the main key idea is the traits which actually seems to be useless, but there is always a purpose behind them in the evolution. Okay, so they seems to be useless at one go. Apparently, they seem useless, but there is always a purpose of them in the evolution, and that is what he gave an example of vestigial, and then the spindles, and then the feathers. Okay, so they appear useless, but they have an evolutionary function behind it. Okay, so let's go and see the questions of it. So, what is the principal argument? So let me just clear the drawings. Sorry. What I'm doing. Okay, so what is the principal argument that the author is making in the passage? So what is the principal argument that the author is making in the passage is a question that revolves around the main idea. Okay, so let's go by the options to options here. Okay, so, okay, the author, okay, yeah. So seemingly obscure and useless traits of creatures actually have a reason or explanations that ties it with the evolution. So in case if you have just listened to the summary of the passage, then you know that this is actually the correct answer. Okay, so seemingly obscure, okay, and useless traits of creatures actually have a reason or explanation that ties it with the evolution. So I told you that the vestigial or the spindles, apparently they seem useless, but there is actually a kind of a evolutionary purpose behind them. Okay, so the author is actually talking about the theory of evolution and is telling that there are certain features which seems to be useless are not actually useless. Okay, so see, it strengthens the theory of evolution in that that these seemingly weaker individuals are actually showing how well they can do in the face of the adversity. It is the evolutionary equivalent of using a blah, blah, blah kind of a thing. Okay. So it is giving, it strengthens the theory of evolution. Now, what is this strengthens the theory of evolution? So the, sorry, ostentatious plumage, okay, or showing feathers of the birds, okay, they seems to be useless, but there is a purpose, and that purpose actually strengthens the theory of evolution, because the main purpose of those kinds of the feathers is that so that they can attract a mate and they can pass on the genes. Okay, so it strengthens the theory of evolution. Okay, similarly in the para 4 also there was a line, no, okay, not para 4, it's actually in the para number, last para. Okay, so although the chin throws a spindle in the works, there is nearly always a reason or at least an explanation for the myriad traits we see across biology. Okay, so it, although the chin throws, okay, so it again strengthening the case, okay, that there are some of the physical or so they seem obscure and the useless traits of creatures actually have a reason or explanation that ties it with evolution. Okay, so there is always a purpose behind it. Okay, so the chin or the feathers at one go, they seems to be useless. Okay, but then they have a reason or trait explanation that ties it with the evolution. Now, what is the option number second is saying? None of the biological traits and characteristics of humans and animals have a basis in functional adaptation or individual. Now, first of all, it has let me just clear it to make you understand it better. Okay, so none of the biological, this is an extreme word. Okay, so none of the biological traits and characteristics of humans and animals have a basis in functional adaptation or evolution. So there is none of the biological traits and characteristics that of humans and animals that have a basis in functional adaptation or evolution. First of all, it is exact opposite of the passage. Okay, and secondly, it is actually dismissing the role of evolution. Okay, so it is saying that the evolution, the any biological trait or the characteristics altogether has not any kind of a role in adaptation or of evolution. So this is extremely incorrect. Okay, it is exactly opposite of the first and the last para, I would say. Okay, so none of the biological traits and characteristics of humans and animals have a basis in functional adaptation or evolution. And this none is an extreme. It is saying that none of the human part has actually some relation to the theory of evolution and adaptation, which is extremely, okay. It is altogether, it is actually dismissing the role of evolution in any biological trait or characteristic altogether. Okay. Now, the third, sexual selection may have had a much larger role to play in the evolutionary process than was earlier believed. Okay, so we know that the sexual color part is being mentioned in the two. Okay, so many species invest heavily in camouflage and other means of blending into the surroundings to avoid predators. Okay, so the physically heavy and downright ostentatious plumage of birds of paradise, peacocks, and many other birds seems like a clear invitation to be eaten, but crucially, they help these birds pass on their genes because they increase their chances of attracting a mate. Okay, so this is saying that sexual selection may have had a much larger role to play in the evolutionary process than was earlier believed. Okay, so we don't know about the much larger role, and secondly, this is not the main idea. Okay, it is not the central argument, and it is also not true based on the information of the passage. In para 2, the author describes how sexual selection is the reason some birds have an ostentatious plumage. Okay, but there is no mention of the role of sexual selection. Let's say no mention of a role of a sexual selection being larger than it is deemed to be. Okay, so this much larger role is incorrect. First of all, this option is actually incorrect, and secondly, it is not the main idea. Okay, now the fourth option, some of the physical or biological traits like the chins are merely quirks that exist for their own sake. This is incorrect. Okay, now the para number 4, it says that as human diets change, the bones and muscles in our jaws became smaller, so we don't waste energy on them, but we are left with a protruding bone at the bottom of the face, and no one has come up with a whole convincing reason why, although the chin throws a spindle in the work, there is nearly always a reason or at least an explanation for the myriad traits we see across biology. And this is say that some of the physical or biological traits like the chin are merely quirks that exist for their own sake. Okay, so this is actually so it is saying that the chin is not a quirk that exists for its own sake, but it can be traced back to its evolutionary purpose. There is an evolutionary purpose behind the chin. Okay, so that is the case that the fourth is an incorrect answer and the first is the correct answer. Hope you got this answer correct. Okay, so it is like the main idea is that some traits, they seems to be useless. Okay, is talking about the theory of evolution, and some traits that seems to be useless are not actually useless. There's a purpose behind it. Okay, so let's move on to the next question.